The letter from the Dominion Lands Office had been sitting on the kitchen windowsill since Tuesday. She had not moved it. He had not moved it either. It lay exactly where he had set it after reading it the first time. Face down against the glass, one corner lifted by a draft that had since gone still, and the frost that worked at the window each night had made the paper soft along the bottom edge. 4 days. Neither of them had said a word about it. She stood at the stove and looked through the glass, past the letter, out toward the paddock fence along the east side of the yard. She had repaired it herself in September, when he was laid up with the fever and couldn't lift his arms above his shoulders without his breath going short. 3 posts had heaved over the summer, pushed up by the spring frost, and the wire between them had gone slack and useless. She'd pulled each post, tamped new holes, reset them by sighting along the line of the others the way she had watched old Pemberton do it the previous year. It had taken 2 full days. She had made one mistake. The second post went in a half-inch low, and she hadn't caught it until the wire was already strung, and she had stood there for a long moment calculating whether it mattered enough to pull everything back to the right and start again. It didn't. The wire sat taut. The fence held the cattle where it was supposed to hold them. She knew exactly where she had driven every staple. She would have been embarrassed once to think that was the kind of thing a person could be proud of. She wasn't embarrassed anymore. The letter on the windowsill had the Dominion's crest in the upper left corner. She had seen that crest before on other documents, and she understood what kind of news tended to travel under it. She turned from the window. It was time to open it. October 1893. 3 years and 2 months since she had stepped down from the freight wagon at the edge of a quarter section of open prairie on a Monday afternoon in late August, when the grass was still gold and the sky above the Saskatchewan plain ran blue all the way to the edge of the world. She had come down into heat she hadn't expected. She had always imagined the prairies as cold, some failure of the imagination she'd never corrected. And she'd stood beside the road with her carpetbag and the account ledger she carried everywhere and the lie she had been quietly rehearsing since Moose Jaw. He had been waiting by the gate. He was not what she'd imagined. The advertisement in the Moose Jaw Times had asked for an experienced hand who could manage cattle and keep the farm accounts. It had said nothing about the man himself, and she had constructed him from the shape of the advertisement. Older, probably thick-set. The kind of farmer who posted notices in newspapers because he couldn't hold anyone through a hard winter any other way. She had been wrong on every count. He was tall and lean and still in the way of a person who had learned long ago that stillness cost nothing, and he looked at her from the gate without surprise, which was itself surprising. He had known from her letter that she was a woman. Most men in his position would have used that as grounds not to write back. He had written back. She walked to the gate. He opened it without speaking. He looked at her carpetbag and then at her face in that order and asked, "You've managed cattle before?" She had one breath, perhaps less. "I have," she said. Was the lie. The whole of it right there, clean and flat as a stone laid on water. She had kept accounts for a cattle broker in Regina for 2 years. That much was true. And she knew what cattle cost and what they sold for and what a feed rotation looked like on paper and what it meant when the columns didn't balance. She did not know what any of it looked like from the ground. She had never wintered livestock. She had never pulled a calf or read the weather off a prairie sky the way a person who had grown up beside it could read it without thinking. She did not know by the sound an animal made whether it needed a vet or only company. She had told herself on the wagon from Moose Jaw that she would explain when she arrived, that she would find a way to say it that was truthful without being disqualifying. The right moment had not come, and so the lie had come instead, smooth and unremarkable, and he had nodded once and picked up her carpetbag and led her up the path to the farmhouse, and that had been that. His son, Arlo, was in the yard by the water pump. 11 years old, quiet in the particular way of children who have grown up without a great deal of noise around them. He looked at her from under the brim of a hat 2 sizes too big for his head and said nothing. She nodded at him. He nodded back. Hit. There was an assessment in the exchange, and she could not have said with certainty that she had passed it. The farmhouse was plain and well kept. Kitchen, 2 bedrooms, a sitting room that would not see a fire until January. The kitchen stove was the center of things, and she understood within a day that the family lived inside its radius and managed. There was a ledger open on the kitchen table, turned to a page from June. She looked at it for 3 seconds while his back was turned, and she saw it immediately, the way you see a crooked picture frame or a fence post out of line with the others. The columns were recorded correctly, every entry in its place. The arithmetic was simply wrong, error compounding forward from month to month, accumulating in the total the way a small debt accumulates when nobody catches it in time. She pulled her eyes from the ledger before he turned around. She said nothing. She spent the first 2 weeks watching. She watched how he moved through a morning, what order he did things in, which silences meant he was thinking, and which meant he had already decided. She watched Arlo, watching her from doorways the same way she watched everything, quietly and at a slight distance, reserving judgment. She watched old Pemberton, the seasonal hand, and tried to absorb from his movements the things that couldn't be found in any account book. How to read the weight of a cow's hindquarters before a hard winter. How to know from the way a horse held its ears whether the weather was about to change. She made mistakes. A misjudgment about the salt lick that Pemberton corrected without commentary. A wrong call on which pasture would hold through a wet September, which she caught herself before it cost anything. She felt each error the way you feel a misstep on ice. That half-second of warning before you know whether you're going to recover. She recovered, every time, quietly, without announcing either the error or the correction. It was the bridle that changed things. A cracked leather strap on the driving harness, split along a stress line, the kind of fracture that would open clean through in cold weather and leave a man without a working rig on a morning when he needed one. She saw it on the 3rd day and said nothing. That evening she took it to her room with the needle case she kept in her bag. A good curved needle, heavy gauge, and waxed linen threadmen her mother had taught her to use for anything that needed to hold under strain. And she worked on it for an hour by lamplight, drawing the seam back together with stitches tight enough to be nearly invisible. She had repaired leather before, years ago, for different reasons. The principle was the same as any seam. It had to hold before it was tested, not after. Pemberton found it the next morning and turned it over in his hands. He said something to him in the yard that afternoon. She was at the kitchen window, and she saw the man look up from what he was doing. He did not look toward the house. He looked down at the strap in the old hand's hands for a long moment, then went back to work. She turned from the window and finished what she was doing, and said nothing about it then or later. 3 weeks after she arrived, she asked if she might go through the accounts properly. She said it plainly, without apology. He looked at her for a moment and then pushed the ledger across the table without a word. She sat with it for a long evening under the lamp. She found 4 months of compounding arithmetic error, and beneath that, something else. A recurring line in the expense column, monthly, notated as grazing access. East quarter. The amount was consistent. The handwriting was not his. It took her another 2 weeks to understand what the charge was. The original homestead grant, filed in 1887, the year he'd broken ground on this quarter section, had included a shared grazing access clause with the adjacent property. The adjacent property had at that time belonged to a man who'd gone back east after one hard winter and never returned. It now belonged to a man named Lawson, who ran cattle on the section to the north and who had been for 18 months billing for shared grazing rights on the east quarter as though the original access agreement were still in force. It was not. The original clause had contained a sunset provision, clearly written, conditional on renewed filing with the Dominion Lands Office every 5 years. No such renewal had been filed. The clause had lapsed in August of 1891. Either Lawson had not read it, or he had read it and decided that a farmer who kept his own books might not read it either. She sat with the grant document for a long time. Arlo was in bed. The man was in the other room. The lamp made a yellow circle over the papers, and she read the sunset provision 3 times to be certain she was reading it correctly. She was. She began writing to the Dominion Lands Office in November, signing her letters with initials only. The first letter asked a dry procedural question that any land office clerk would answer without stopping to wonder who had sent it. The second asked about the conditions under which a shared access clause would lapse. The third asked whether the adjacent property holder, 1G Lawson, had filed any renewal with the Dominion. The answer to the third letter came in February and said plainly that no such filing had been made. The access agreement had lapsed in August 1891. Any fees collected against it after that date were without legal basis. She read that letter standing at the kitchen table in her coat, still cold from checking the cattle. She read it again. Then she folded it along its crease and put it with the others she had been keeping at the bottom of her trunk, beneath a wool dress she no longer wore. She found the name of a land agent in Regina through the territorial land records, a Mr. Fairweather, whose letters were precise and who did not use 3 words when 2 would do. And she wrote to him in March and laid out everything. The clause, the lapse, the ongoing billing, 14 months of payments at a rate Lawson had set himself, with no legal authority to set. Fairweather wrote back in April. He said the case was straightforward. He would need the original grant documents and her records of every payment. She sent them. She told no one. Lawson came on a Thursday in June. She heard his wagon from the yard and recognized the big gray horse before she saw the man, and she understood what the visit was before he had set foot on the ground. Men like Lawson came to things the same way. Unannounced, mid-morning, when the farmer was likely to be in the far field, and whoever remained in the house could be counted on to be uncertain about her authority. She was not uncertain. She came out the front door with the deed folder under her arm before he had reached the gate. He was a large man with the confidence of someone who had not often been meaningfully contradicted. He looked at her, the way men looked at women they had not planned to deal with, measuring how quickly he could redirect the matter toward a more suitable authority. She did not give him the moment. She said she was glad he had come, and she meant it, and the evenness in her voice meant something different from what he expected. She told him she had been intending to reach out about the grazing access payments, 14 months of them, and the sunset clause in the 1887 grant that had lapsed in August of 1891 without renewal. She said the Dominion Lands Office had confirmed in writing that the access agreement was no longer in force and that any fees collected after the lapse date were without legal standing. She said she had engaged a land agent in Regina to handle the recovery of those amounts, and that Lawson would be receiving correspondence from that agent within the fortnight. He looked at the folder under her arm. He looked at her face. He did not speak for a moment that was long enough to say something on its own. "Who are you?" he said finally. "I keep the accounts," she said, "and I read the documents." He drove away without dismounting. The letter from the Dominion arrived on a Tuesday in October, confirming the amended boundary description, the lapsed clause struck from the record, the eastern quarter clean and unencumbered. Fairweather's letter arrived the same week with the settlement terms. She read both letters twice at the kitchen table, and then set them on the windowsill where he would see them when he came in. He stood at the window for a long time. She didn't look up from the bread she was cutting. She heard the paper move as he picked the letters up, and then the sound of them being set back down. Arlo talked at supper about a horse at the Holroyd place he thought was going lame in the left foreleg. He said he didn't know whether it was worth mentioning to old Holroyd, or whether a man like that preferred to work these things out himself. The man considered the question as seriously as he considered everything, and said Holroyd was the kind who liked to be told early. Arlo said he'd ride over in the morning. The evening moved on. She finished her supper and thought about the windowsill and what came next. After Arlo went to bed, she went out to the porch. The cold had set in properly now, the kind that meant the season had decided. He was already there, leaning against the post with his coffee gone cold, looking out toward the east pasture. She sat on the step below him and told him about Fairweather first. She said she had been corresponding with a land agent in Regina since November of last year. She explained the sunset clause, the lapsed agreement, the 14 months of payments. She said she had gathered the documents herself and sent everything to Fairweather in the spring, and that the settlement amount would come back to them before the new year. She said she thought with that recovery and the balance at the bank in Haltane's Crossing, the seed loan could be cleared before spring. The eastern boundary would be clean on the Dominion's records going forward. No shared access claim for anyone to press against. He held his cold cup in both hands and looked at the fence line. The posts she had reset in September held their line in the dark. He asked how long she had known. November, she told him, when she went through the accounts properly. He was quiet. An owl started somewhere past the tree line and then stopped. She looked at her hands. There's something else, she said. He waited. She told him she had not managed a cattle operation before she came here. She said she had kept accounts for a broker in Regina. That was true, but that she had never wintered livestock or managed pasture rotation or done the work she had told him she could do the day she arrived. She said she had learned it here. She said she was sorry she hadn't told him the truth sooner. The cold came up from the step beneath her. She kept her hands still on her knees and watched the dark line of the fence and waited for whatever came next. He was quiet for a long time. It was not the silence of a man deciding. It was the silence of a man who had already arrived somewhere and was only now finding how to say it. I know, he said. She looked at him. He was still watching the fence. Knew by the second week, he said. The way you watched Pemberton with the cattle, you were learning, not checking. She let that settle. And you kept me on, she said. He turned his cup in his hands. You fixed the harness, he said. It was not quite an explanation, more like a point on a map, and he was letting her locate herself on it. The bridle strap, first week, before I'd even found it. She remembered the lamplight and the needle, and the hour she had spent drawing the seam back together. A person who fixes what's broken without being asked and says nothing about it afterward, he said, is worth more than any credential. She looked at the fence she had repaired. The posts stood level in the dark. I should have told you sooner, she said. Probably, he said, one word, quiet, without weight behind it. Something moved in the south field. A fox, or only the shape of one, gone before she could be certain. I have something to tell you too, he said. She waited. He said that when he'd filed the original homestead papers in 1887, he hadn't fully understood the access clause. He said he'd read it and told himself he understood it and signed, and then he'd carried the doubt in his chest ever since, too ashamed to ask anyone to explain it in plainer terms. He said he had seen the grazing payments in the ledger and felt that same old doubt again and done nothing, because doing something would have meant admitting he hadn't understood what he was signing to begin with. The creek below the east pasture made it sound. You fixed that too, he said, without saying so. It seemed like the thing to do, she said. He nodded once. That was all. That was enough. They stayed on the porch until the cold made sitting still impractical. Then he stood, and she stood, and he opened the door and held it, and she went through ahead of him into the kitchen, where the stove still held some warmth, and the lamp made a pale circle on the windowsill where the letters lay. He set his cup in the basin, she set hers beside it. She was already thinking about the morning. The accounts to update, the letter to Fairweather to acknowledge receipt, the west paddock fence that needed looking at before the snow came in earnest. There was always the next thing. She had understood that by the end of her first month here, and it had not unsettled her. It was the same as keeping books. The work was never finished, only brought to the point where it could be passed to the next day. She turned down the lamp. On a Friday in early November, 3 weeks after the letters had come, after the seed loan had been settled at the bank and the recovery from Lawson's account had been deposited, and the balance had reached a figure she had been working toward quietly for 14 months. On that Friday, he came in from the barn an hour before he usually did. His coat was still on. He carried a folded paper she had not seen before. She was at the table with the ledger. She looked up. He set the paper on the table in front of her and said nothing. He took off his coat and hung it on the hook and came back and sat down across from her. She looked at the paper. She did not touch it. Go ahead, he said. She picked it up and unfolded it. It was a deed amendment. The original homestead grant, revised and filed with the Dominion Lands Office through Fairweather's office. The eastern boundary corrected, the lapsed clause removed from the record, and at the bottom, below his name, written in the same careful formal hand as the rest. Her name. She read it once. The ink was new enough to hold a slight sheen in the light coming through the east window, where frost still clung to the lower corners of the glass. He set a pen on the table between them, carefully, parallel to the edge, the way he set tools down. She picked it up. She found the line. She signed her name. She set the pen down and folded the paper once along its crease and set it on the table between them. He took it and crossed to the shelf above the stove and placed it beside the deed box that had always sat there, dented at one corner, unchanged since the day she had first arrived. Arlo came in from somewhere, bringing cold air with him, and looked at the two of them and seemed to understand, the way he had begun to understand most things, that something had been settled without needing to know the particulars. He went to the stove and checked the kettle without being asked and set 3 cups on the counter, one on each side of the space between them, the way he had started doing in recent months, quietly, without announcement, as though the arrangement of 3 cups at the same table were simply the way things were. She picked up hers and held it in both hands and let the warmth come through. Outside, the prairie held the last of the evening light for as long as it could and then let it go, the way it always did, without ceremony, without apology. And the cold came in from the north to take everything the day had left behind, and the farm sat inside it. The boundary clean on every document that mattered, the account balanced to the dollar, the east fence running straight across the frozen ground, every post level, every staple where she had driven it, holding.